Nora had spent the drive up to the lake doing the things she always did before family gatherings, rehearsing. Not conversations exactly, more like armor. She ran through the likely comments in her head the way an actor runs lines, so that when they arrived, delivered with the same casual cruelty they always carried, she'd already have her face arranged into something unbothered, her response already loaded and ready to fire back with a joke instead of a flinch. She'd been doing this specific kind of preparation since she was old enough to recognize the pattern, and by 34 she'd gotten good enough at it that most of her family assumed, quite sincerely, that none of it bothered her anymore. The Abernathy family reunion happened every 2 years, always over a long weekend in July, always at some lodge or campground large enough to swallow the 60-odd relatives who showed up across 4 generations. This year it was a place called Birchwater Lodge on the shore of a lake in northern Michigan, all knotty pine and screened porches and a dock that stretched out into water cold enough to make the younger cousins shriek every summer when they cannonballed off the end of it. Nora had been coming to these reunions her entire life, first as a child dragged along by her parents, then as a teenager finding small pockets of genuine joy in canoe races with cousins closer to her age, and now, as an adult, as something closer to unpaid event staff, the one who arrived early to help unload folding tables from the rental truck, who kept the family group chat organized with head counts and dietary restrictions, who remembered that Uncle Ray was allergic to shellfish and that Cousin Devon's toddler needed a specific brand of formula, small useful facts she collected and deployed the way other people might collect compliments. She'd understood, from a very young age, that usefulness was a currency she could reliably earn even when other things, the things Bethany and her golden retriever Ease seemed to generate without trying, remained permanently out of reach. It started, as far as Nora could ever trace it back, at a 4th of July barbecue when she was 6 years old. Her Aunt Patrice, holding a glass of white wine and standing near the dessert table, had looked between Nora and her cousin Bethany, who was 5 months older and already possessed of the kind of symmetrical, camera-ready face that made strangers in grocery stores stop to comment on it, and said, to another aunt, in a voice she clearly thought was quiet enough not to carry, "Isn't it funny how genetics work?" Bethany got that perfect little rosebud face, and poor Nora got, well, she hadn't finished the sentence. She hadn't needed to. Nora had been standing 3 feet away holding a paper plate of watermelon, old enough at 6 to understand precisely what had just been implied, and too young to have any framework yet for deciding she was allowed to be hurt by it. She remembered, with unsettling clarity even decades later, the specific texture of that watermelon slice going warm and forgotten in her hand while she processed what she'd just overheard. The nickname, the ugly one, didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated the way sediment accumulates, one small comment layered over another across years of holidays and reunions and birthday parties, until by the time Nora was a teenager it had calcified into something the whole family seemed to accept as simple description rather than judgment. Her grandmother Eleanor, well-meaning in the specific, oblivious way of a woman who'd never once considered that her words might land as anything other than affectionate, had a habit of introducing Nora to new people at family gatherings with some version of "This is Nora, she's the smart one," a phrase that always sounded, to Nora's ear, less like a compliment about her intelligence and more like an explanation offered in advance for why she didn't look like the rest of them. Uncle Ray, Eleanor's younger brother, had a joke he recycled at nearly every gathering, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once been told to stop. "At least you got your dad's brains instead of his looks, huh? Good thing, too." He'd been telling some version of that joke since Nora was 12, and every single time, several relatives laughed. Nora had tried, across her 20s, various strategies for surviving these comments. In her early 20s she'd tried arguing back, defending herself with genuine hurt in her voice, and had learned quickly that this only ever resulted in her being labeled sensitive or unable to take a joke, labels that somehow became new weapons themselves, deployed the next time she tried to push back on anything. In her mid-20s she'd tried simply avoiding the reunions altogether, skipping 2 of them in a row with vague excuses about work, and had found that this only generated a different, equally unpleasant category of comment. Aunt Patrice calling to ask, with syrupy concern, whether Nora was doing okay, mentally. As though her absence were itself evidence of some fragility rather than a reasonable response to years of casual cruelty. Eventually, she'd landed on the strategy that worked best, or at least hurt the least. Showing up, staying useful, and building a shell of humor and competence thick enough that the comments could land against it without quite reaching whatever was underneath. By her 30s, she'd become genuinely excellent at this. She was, by any objective measure, a successful person, a marketing director at a mid-sized firm in Chicago, a woman with a small, loyal group of close friends who found her funny and warm and easy to be around, a woman who'd traveled to a dozen countries and run 2 half-marathons and rebuilt a vintage motorcycle in her garage over a rainy autumn largely by herself, teaching herself from YouTube tutorials out of sheer stubborn curiosity. None of it seemed to matter, not really, not inside the specific gravitational field of her extended family, where she remained, permanently and apparently immutably, the ugly one, a role assigned to her at 6 years old that no accomplishment in the decades since had managed to dislodge. The breakup with Daniel 4 months earlier had reopened all of it in a way Nora hadn't expected. They dated for 2 years, long enough that she'd started cautiously to believe some of the old narrative might finally be wrong, and when he'd ended things with the particular vague, unsatisfying explanation of, "I just don't think I'm feeling it the way I should," she'd spent weeks turning the phrase over in her mind, hunting for the specific flaw in her it must have been pointing toward, before her closest friend Rena had finally, gently, told her to stop. Some relationships just end, Nora. It doesn't mean anything about your face. Nora had nodded and said she knew that, and hadn't quite believed it. So she'd arrived at Birchwater Lodge that Friday afternoon in July already tired in the specific way she always was before these weekends, her armor already checked and rechecked, bracing herself for the familiar gauntlet even as she smiled and hugged relatives and helped Uncle Ray's son carry coolers from the truck to the kitchen. The comments came, as they always did, within the first hour of arrival, small, glancing, delivered so casually that anyone watching from outside the family might not have registered them as unkind at all, which was, Nora had come to understand over the years, almost the worst part of it. Nobody in her family thought of themselves as cruel. They'd simply been swimming in the same water for 3 decades, repeating the same jokes and assumptions so long that nobody thought to question whether the water was actually warm. The comments on Saturday had been, by Nora's usual metric, a fairly standard batch. Nothing especially sharp, nothing that would stand out later as a particular low point, just the steady background hum she'd learned to tune out the way you tune out traffic noise outside an apartment window. Aunt Patrice's remark about Nora being our practical one, never much for the Mirror, had barely registered before Nora moved on to help her cousin's kids build a fire for Mores. Bethany's comment about online dating had stung for exactly as long as it took Nora to find her mother and get pulled into a conversation about the lake house someone was considering buying nearby, and then it had folded itself neatly into the same drawer where she kept the rest of it, filed and forgotten, or at least filed and pretended forgotten, which by this point in her life amounted to nearly the same thing. She was at the drinks table on Saturday evening, the sky doing that long, golden thing it does over Michigan lakes in July, mosquitoes just starting to gather in the shade near the pines, when Margaret introduced herself. Nora had noticed her earlier in the day, actually from a distance, a silver-haired woman sitting alone for a while on the lodge's wraparound porch, watching the reunion's chaos with an expression Nora couldn't quite read, something between amusement and appraisal. She'd assumed, as she assumed about most unfamiliar faces at these things, that Margaret belonged to one of the more distant branches of the family, a second cousin's new wife or a great-uncle's companion, someone whose specific thread back to the Abernathy named Nora had never bothered to learn because there were, frankly, too many threads to keep track of after 4 generations. "You're Eleanor's granddaughter," Margaret said, setting down her own glass beside Nora's on the drinks table. "Nora, is it?" "That's right." Nora extended a hand, startled by the directness. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Margaret Voss," she said, shaking Nora's hand with a grip firmer than her slight frame suggested. "I knew your grandmother years ago, long before any of you were born, actually. I hadn't been to one of these reunions in decades. Your Uncle Ray tracked me down through some genealogy website and insisted I come this year, said it was about time." She said the last part with a small, wry smile, as though there were a private joke buried in it that Nora wasn't yet in on. That was kind of him, Nora said, and meant it, though something in Margaret's phrasing had already snagged her attention. About time implied a debt, an overdue reckoning, and Nora wasn't sure what kind. Margaret studied her for a moment, longer than was entirely comfortable, the way you feel a stranger's gaze land and stay a beat past normal. You have your great-grandmother's face, you know. Almost exactly. It's remarkable, really. I haven't seen that particular combination in 3 generations. Nora laughed, the short, reflexive sound she deployed automatically whenever a compliment threatened to actually land somewhere real. I don't think anyone's ever called it remarkable before. Something shifted behind Margaret's eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion she'd been quietly testing. No, she said slowly, glancing past Nora toward the cluster of relatives gathered near the fire pit, toward the sound of Aunt Patrice's laugh carrying easily across the lawn. I don't imagine they have. She didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, she gestured toward 2 empty Adirondack chairs a little apart from the main crowd, angled toward the water, and asked if Nora would sit with her a while. There was something in the invitation, unhurried, oddly formal, entirely unlike the frantic, overlapping small talk that usually define these reunions, that made Nora say yes before she'd fully decided to. They sat as the sky deepened toward its last hour of gold, and Margaret asked Nora questions nobody in her family had asked in years. Not the perfunctory, "How's work?" that people asked while already looking past you for the next conversation, but real questions, patient ones, about the motorcycle Nora had rebuilt, about the half-marathons, about a photography hobby Nora had picked up during the pandemic and mostly abandoned once things opened back up again. Nora found herself talking more than she usually did at these gatherings, surprised by how easy it was, how little bracing it required. Eventually, as the fire pit crowd grew louder somewhere behind them, Margaret asked, with the same unhurried directness she'd used from the start, "Has anyone in this family ever actually told you you're beautiful?" Nora opened her mouth to deflect, the reflex already halfway formed, some joke about not needing that kind of validation, some easy dismissal she could offer and move past, and found, to her own surprise, that she couldn't quite make the joke land. "Not really," she admitted instead, quietly. "Not that I remember." Margaret nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to actually hear it, not just be polite about it. I was your great-grandmother Ida's closest friend for almost 50 years. We met when we were 19. I watched that woman become, by every measure I ever saw applied to a person in this family, the most striking woman in 3 counties, and I watched, over the decades, this family do something very particular and very unkind to every girl who happened to inherit her features instead of the ones your Aunt Patrice's side of the family carries." Nora went very still. "What do you mean?" Ida had a strong nose, strong brow, a face with real structure to it, character, the kind of face that photographs like nothing else in a room once a person's grown into it, but doesn't necessarily read as conventionally pretty on a child, or even a young woman before the bone structure settles. Ida used to tell me this family spent her whole childhood calling her plain, calling her the sturdy one, comparing her endlessly to a cousin with soft, round, easy features that read as pretty at every age, including 6 years old, including 16, in a way Ida's face simply never was going to. Margaret's voice had gone quieter, more careful, as though she were handling something fragile. And then Ida turned 25 and 30, and that same bone structure everyone had spent 2 decades quietly pitying became the thing strangers stopped her on the street to comment on. I watched it happen. I watched men fall over themselves. And I watched this family never once apologize, never once acknowledge what they'd spent her whole childhood telling her about her own face. Nora sat with that, the fire pit crackling somewhere behind them, a loom calling out across the darkening water. "You're saying I look like her?" "I'm saying you look almost exactly like her, in a way I haven't seen skip a generation quite this cleanly before. And I'm saying I recognized, the moment I saw you across that lawn this afternoon, exactly what this family was doing to you. because I watched them do it to her for 25 years before the rest of the world caught up and proved them all wrong. Nora felt something complicated rise in her chest. Not quite vindication, not quite grief, some tangled combination of both. She never told anyone that story. My grandmother never mentioned it. Your grandmother, Margaret said, with a small, tired precision, was one of the cousins doing the comparing when they were girls. Ida forgave her for it, eventually, the way people forgive family. But she never forgot it, and near the end of her life, she made me promise something. Margaret reached over and set a hand briefly, lightly, on Nora's arm. She made me promise that if this family ever produced another girl with her face, and I ever met her, I'd make sure someone actually told her the truth before she spent as many years as Ida did believing the wrong story about herself. Nora didn't know what to say to that. She looked out at the water, throat tight, aware of Aunt Patrice's laugh still drifting over from the fire pit, aware of 30 years of paper plates and watermelon and careful jokes suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape she'd never had the information to see clearly before. I have photographs of her, Margaret said. From when she was your age, and later when she was 60 and turning heads at every party she walked into. I brought a few, actually. I wasn't sure I'd have the nerve to show you until I actually met you, but I think you should see them. She pulled a small envelope from her bag, worn soft at the corners, and handed it to Nora with a gentleness that made Nora's hands feel suddenly clumsy opening it. The photographs inside were black and white, then color, spanning what looked like 5 decades, a young woman with a strong, distinctive face, unmistakably striking even in grainy mid-century film stock, and then, unmistakably, undeniably, Nora's own bone structure looking back at her from a woman 50 years dead, a woman she'd never once heard described as anything but the sturdy one. In 34 years of family stories. Nora sat there for a long time, the photographs in her lap, the sky finally sliding into full dark over the lake, and felt something in her chest that had been braced and clenched for nearly 3 decades finally, carefully begin to loosen. Thank you, she said finally, her voice not quite steady. For telling me. For coming. I should have come years ago, Margaret said. I'm sorry it took this long, but I'm glad I finally got to keep my promise. Behind them, across the lawn, Aunt Patrice's voice rose again in another burst of easy laughter, oblivious, unchanged, still swimming in the same water she'd been swimming in for 30 years. Nora looked toward the sound for a moment, then back down at the photographs in her lap, at a face that was unmistakably her own reaching across 50 years to tell her something her own family had never once managed to say. She didn't confront anyone that weekend. She didn't need to, not yet. But she drove home from Birchwater Lodge that Sunday with the envelope of photographs tucked carefully in her bag, and something inside her that had been quietly, patiently waiting her entire life had finally, unmistakably, begun to change.